Okay, so we're going to look at using end behavior and intercepts to graph a polynomial. So this is kind of the culmination of all sorts of things about polynomials. So we're going to go through the rules and stuff first. So first, end behavior depends on the degree of your polynomial. If you have an even degree, it acts like a quadratic. So it opens up if it's positive, negative if it's down, if it's negative, Now, that's just the behavior on the ends, right? So we're not sure what's going to happen there in the middle. We have other pieces of information that will tell us that. If we have an odd degree, it acts like a cubic kind of. So it goes down to up if it's positive, up to down if it's negative. And again, that's just about the behavior on the ends, right? Not the middle. To find the x-intercepts, we're going to set our function equal to 0 and solve. What we end up doing here is just pulling out those zeros, okay? Now, we do want to pay attention to the multiplicity of the factor. If the factor has an even multiplicity, that means that that 0 is going to bounce or touch the axis, okay? If we have a factor that has an odd multiplicity, 1, 3, 5, right? That means that the factor is going to cross the graph there. And then for the y-intercept, we'll let x equal 0 and solve. We do f of 0. And this is going to be really specific to Alex because Alex will have us put our points on our graph and then tell it how the graph behaves at those intercepts. And so these are my choices, right? It either crosses and goes up, crosses and goes down, bounces down, down, bounces up, up. Okay? So let's try it. We're going to go through the first one real slow. Okay? So here's our function. First, we need to think about our end behavior. So we need to know what the degree of our polynomial is. So notice we have an x squared, and an x. So altogether, that's x to the fourth, which tells me my end behavior is up, up, right? Positive, even. For zeros, we set our function equal to 0. Okay, and then we're just pulling those zeros out, right? So if x plus 2 equals 0, then x equals negative 2, right? So we pull all those out, and we're going to make special note that we do have a factor that is squared. So that means that this 0 is important because it's from a factor with an even multiplicity, which results in a bounce on the graph. And then my other two zeros are crosses. Now to find the y-intercept, we look at f of 0. So we go into our function and replace all the x's with zeros. And I end up, ooh, that went real fast. I end up with, sorry about that, a negative 2. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my graph and I'm going to plot those 4 points. Okay, so those are my 4 points. I have 3 zeros, 2 of which are cross, 1 is a bounce, and then I have a y-intercept. So now I'm going to use those tools that I showed you a minute ago and the end behavior to decide what's happening everywhere on the graph. Always start from the left. We're going to go left to right, picking up our points. So at negative 2 is a 0, and my graph has to cross at negative 2. But remember, it has to start up. So at negative 2, the graph must do that, right? And then at negative 1, there's a bounce. So we have to go pick up the negative 1 and then bounce down. The only behavior for a y-intercept really, at least in this situation, is a bounce, right? Because it's not going to continue going down. I suppose it could, but here it's got to bounce back up because it's got to go pick up that 1, and then at 1 it crosses. Once you've put all of that stuff in, Alex can graph it for you, and this is what the overall graph would look like. But we're not too concerned about that because as long as we have these pieces in, we're good. Okay, we're going to do several more. We're going to start picking up the pace a little bit. Okay, so first thing we have to do is decide the end behavior. So first I have a negative out front, so that needs to stay. And then I have an x, and an x squared. So that's a negative x to the fourth. So that means my end behavior is down, right? So my graph is going to start down in that lower left and end down in the lower right. Looking at zeros, we set our function equal to 0 and solve. And so we're just pulling those zeros out, right? Notice that negative doesn't have an impact there because it doesn't have a variable. Now we're going to look at, do we have any even multiplicities? And we do. So since we have an even multiplicity, that 0 I know is going to bounce and the other two will cross. Next, we're going to look for the y-intercept, and to do that, we do f of 0. So we go into our function, replace all the x's with zeros, and we get 4. So now we're going to put those 3 points on our graph. I have 3 zeros and a y-intercept. So now we're going to look at the behavior at each of those zeros. We know that our graph has to start down in the lower left, and it crosses at -1, so that must be our behavior. Then we've got to go up and get that 4, but it has to come back down to get the 1. At the 1, we have another 0, but it crosses, so we must cross there. And then at 2, we have a bounce, so it just bounces, and it's going to end in the right spot, which is the bottom right. Okay. We have our function. We need to see what our end behavior is. So this is an x to the 5th, which means it is down to up, right? Next, I'm going to pull my zeros. So I set f of x equal to 0. There they are, right? So we're kind of picking up the pace. We don't need to set each factor equal to 0 individually. We know what's going to happen. And we're going to see, do we have any even multiplicities? We sure do. We have 2 of them. So both of those will result in a bounce, and the other guy will be a cross. Then we're going to find the y-intercept by doing f of 0, and we get 2. Next, we put all of those points on our graph, and now we use our end behavior and our crosses and bounces to decide what happens. We know this graph should start bottom left and end top right. So starting bottom left, we have a cross at -2, excuse me. At -1, we have a bounce, which makes sense because we have to bounce on that -1 to be able to go up and pick up that 2. That's a y-intercept. Then we've got to pick up that 2 and go back down for the 1. But the 1 is a bounce, which is good, because if the 1 wasn't a bounce, if it was a cross, it would end down right, and we need it to end up right. Okay? Looking at our function, we need to look at our power and sign. So we are at -x to the 4th here, so that is down. So that means our graph will begin bottom left and end bottom right. Next, we pull out our zeros, doing f of x equals 0. I'm just pulling them out. Remember, always the opposite sign. Then we're going to see if we have any that cross. We do have a factor that is squared, so that's a multiplicity of 2, an even multiplicity, which results in a bounce. The other 2 zeros are crosses. Now, we want to find the y-intercept by doing f of 0, and it's 3. And we're going to put everything on our graph. Then we're going to use our end behavior and our crosses and bounces to put our graph in. So we know we have to start bottom left, and we cross at -3. Then we have a bounce at -1, which makes sense. It has to bounce because if it crossed, we wouldn't be able to get up to that 3, right? These are the only x-intercepts of our graph. So we have a bounce at -1, then we've got to go pick up that 3, and then we have a cross at 1, which is good because we should end down, down. Okay, I think this is the last one. So here we are at x to the 4th, so up, up. My zeros are -1 and 2. And they're both crosses, right? Because both of those have an even multiplicity. Now we'll find our y-intercept, which is 4. Putting all that stuff on the graph, now we'll use our end behavior and our zeros, right? So we know we have to start at the top left, and we've got to bounce at that -1 to go pick up that 4. And then from the 4, we've got to come back down to pick up the 2. And the 2 is a bounce, and we know that we should end up, up. Okay, this one is the last one. So last one here, looking at our end behavior, we have a -x cubed. So that goes from up to down. So that means we want our graph to start at the top right and end at the bottom left. Starting by looking at our zeros, we're just pulling those out. Seeing if we have any even multiplicities, we do. So that even multiplicity creates a bounce. We have a cross at the 0. Looking at our y-intercept, it's 4. Putting those values on our graph. Now we're going to look at the behavior everywhere. So we know that our graph has to start top left, and it's got to bounce at the -2. Then we've got to go pick up that 4. Then we're going to cross at the 1, and we needed our graph to end at bottom right, and it does. I hope you found this helpful.